Good day and welcome back to the Hopkins demonstration for us. This is part 5 of what is a forest. Today we're going to continue on with that topic and review what a food chain is, but also talk about something that can disrupt a food chain, and that's going to be invasive species. And specifically today we're going to be looking at 2 plants. So let's go back real quick and think about what is that food chain again. Reviewed it in video 4, but a food chain, if you remember, it's a transfer of energy. Starts with the sunlight, goes down to the plants, the producers, the consumers. There's a primary and secondary consumer that eat that plant or producer. And that first consumer is an herbivore, gets its energy from the plant that got its energy and created its own food from the sun. And then the secondary consumer, a carnivore, or that mix, that omnivore. And then lastly, the decomposers. So what can disrupt that cycle of a food chain? Well, there's lots of things that can do it. Remember, going back to those abiotic functions in a forest, things can change. Disturbances can happen. One that we just had recently here in 2020 and in Oregon were wildfires. The wildfires that burned large portions of our forests. They're a naturally occurring event. Typically where they burned, that doesn't happen for but every few hundred years, called the fire cycle. Talk about that later. But fire, it's a part of the environment. It's a non-living, abiotic function of our forests and ecosystems. What else might disrupt or disturb a forest? Well, abiotic snow. Heavy snow loads can break and damage some plants. Probably not going to disrupt the entire food chain, but it can alter some of the condition and function of that forest. There's wind. Large wind events, which we have come through and leveled and taken out large patches of forests. Again, altering the biotic, the plants. And that's kind of what we're getting at here. That's where the food chain starts. The fire doesn't necessarily burn and eliminate the animals, the consumers, the secondary or primary consumers, but it alters the food. It puts a break in that food chain. So we can have some large events, sometimes small, but those big events are what really can alter it. Another thing, which is probably more common and happens more often, are humans. We introduce invasive species into the forest. And the 2 that we're going to look at today were introduced by humans, and some of the activities that we do, as well as some of the natural events, cause them to really thrive. So one of those plants is right behind me here. You can notice this is actually an interesting tree. This is not the invasive. This is a native, a valley pine. But underneath this little patch of valley pine, which is about 13 years old, you will find this little nasty vine. It has some really tasty berries on it. I'm trying not to poke myself and yell too loud. Oh, it's pretty tough. Oh, gosh. Well, that's a survivor for sure. If I take a little branch off this stem, bring it up close to the camera. Got a few thorns in my fingers from that one. Himalayan Blackberry, introduced quite a while ago, has really thrived and taken off. And that's one of the things that an invasive has in common. It's very hardy. It can grow in a wide range of environments and conditions. It doesn't have a lot of natural predators or control. I mean, I'm not too fond of getting thorns in my fingers, and a lot of the animals look at that blackberry. It's not very good forage. Now, it does have a desirable feature, which we brought it in for. One, the thorns to kind of make barriers and hedges to kind of make property boundary, but it also provided food. The berries are pretty tasty. I mean, we do get a benefit, but that's just to us and maybe a few of the animals. But what these berry patches can do is really dominate and take over an area. And if we were to dive in there, which would be kind of hard, we notice there's not a lot growing on the ground or underneath those Himalayan blackberries. So what does that do to the food chain? Well, it removes the native plants. We're going to spin around and take a look at another area and another plant here in a second. But underneath there should have been growing some ferns, some salal, some Oregon grape, and plants that are a little more palatable to the native wildlife species. And also the berries, the food supply that is native, some animals prefer that. So the Himalayan blackberry, it's a very hardy plant. You probably see it absolutely everywhere you go here in Oregon. Again, great food source, go out berry picking, but it grows in places that we don't really want it out here in the forest. It can also cause problems if you notice here on this ponderosa pine that it's growing in the tree. And that's where that snow load, which isn't really that big of a deal to the food chain, but that invasive, that snow load growing over those little trees, when it gets heavy, those vines, as I was trying to pull it off that tree, you noticed, it doesn't come off real well. That snow weight will just pull those little trees down. Blackberry likes to grow in full sun. Very hardy, very rapidly growing. And it spreads with a unique root system, and the way it makes contact with the ground with its canes and sends out other roots or rhizomes. It's very difficult to get rid of, but it has a lot of impact in our forests. So Himalayan blackberry, one of the many invasives. You can go to the web pages here in Oregon and find, and nationwide, and find what are our most concerned plants of top priority that we don't really want, because they spread, take over areas, remove and break parts of that food chain, and that disrupts the habitat. So let's swing over and take a look at another plant, if I can do this right. So swing to the other side of the road, over here on a little bench. Now you notice on this side of the road, we haven't had an issue with the Himalayan blackberry. Here's what we should see if that Himalayan blackberry wasn't there. A nice mix of ferns. We've got some, in this case, this looks to be a bracken fern. There's some sword fern back in there. We've got our salal. There's some actually native wild blackberry. It's just growing here on the ground. But this plant right here, I'll get the chunk out and do my invasive species removal for the day. Maybe if you look at this, that might be something you recognize. Very easy to notice in the summertime because this was brought over as an ornamental. Very beautiful yellow flowers, Scotch broom. One of the things that grows in our disturbed sites very well, very aggressive. It was also used and brought over here to the West Coast and used in California, and then made its way up here to stabilize soil along the roadsides and construction areas of our highways. So a very hardy plant, but you can find on here these little pods. It produces a seed that is very persistent. And once this thing starts getting established and starts seeding out, it is very difficult, much like the Himalayan blackberry, to get rid of. Very hardy, very rapidly producing, very tolerant of dry sites of very poor soil quality. So it will come in and outcompete quickly the native plants after a disturbance, as well as the planted trees that we put out there. So it's something that we try to eliminate. And I picked this spot here at Hopkins because we don't really have a lot of the native plants. We have a lot of native plants. We don't have a lot of the invasive non-native plants out here. We do our best to try to get rid of them, but it is a constant battle. So once they get here, if you're not diligent, they can take over sites and spread. So you need to do your part, and if you have an area around your school, your home, great community service projects to start trying to eliminate these invasives, get our native plants back in place, especially out in our forests, where we can then reconnect that food chain and restore kind of what natural function looked like to some resemblance in the past. So invasives, there's a lot of information out there. That was just kind of a quick touch on what they are. They're more than plants though. Down at the pond that I showed you in that video 4, we have bullfrogs. So wildlife can also be invasive and introduced, or we can create habitats by human activity that draw them in. So bullfrogs originated over on the East Coast, were brought over here for food and pets. People were able to release them into the wild, and now they are a problem. They eat almost anything that will fit in its mouth. That includes fish, native frogs, baby ducklings, snakes, you name it. Whatever is around that pond is fair game to that carnivore, which is basically one of the top predators in our pond system here, or top of the food chain, as we call it. So lots of, again, invasives out there, from the plants to the animals, and we just have to make sure we do our part to try to avoid the spread of invasives, and when we do have them, control them. So a lot more out there to learn. Hopefully that was just a quick overview, and look forward to seeing you back out here again at Hopkins. Thanks a lot.